right, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Share Screen Africa's Raptor Education Series. For those of you that are new to the series, my name is Kalen Padiachi from the KNAV Conservation Foundation, and I will be your host tonight, as well as for the rest of the series on your the rest of the series to help you navigate your African raptor journey as we meet some of the most dedicated and interesting raptor biologists and conservationists that Africa has to offer. Tonight, we have our headline speaker will be speaking about a very interesting species, of course, which is the osprey. He's going to be telling us more about its migration from Europe to Africa. And then we'll be moving all the way down to East Africa, Lake Naivasha, to join two young African guides who are going to share their experience with us with raptors and birds of prey in general from a guide perspective. So that's going to be super, super exciting. For those of you that have possibly missed some of our talks during the series, and not to worry, you're welcome to visit Share Screen Africa's website, www.sharescreenafrica.org, where you'll be able to find all the episodes that have been recorded for your for you to watch in your own time. Moret will also put that website link up into the chat shortly. So you can jump on there, watch the ones that you've missed, or also catch up on the ones or rewatch the ones that you've or that you enjoyed the most. Same thing with the posters. So this during the course of tonight's session, we'll be sending out those copyright-free Raptor education posters to the email that you used to register for tonight's talk with. Once you get them, please, 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 I always like to say, jump onto your social media platforms, whichever ones you subscribe to, and share them far and wide. These posters have been vetted by raptor conservationists throughout Africa, and we've received information and data for these posters from various different organizations. So they are legit education posters, which are free for you to use as you please. Download them, print them, put them wherever you can. Try and spread the knowledge and the message of raptor conservation in Africa far and wide. So that should be coming through to your inbox shortly. In fact, before 7:30, you'll be getting those in your inboxes. For those of you that may have missed a few of those posters, not to worry, you can find them at KNAV Conservation Foundation's Facebook page, or also on Share Screen Africa's Facebook page. Jump onto our Facebook pages, share them, download them, and yes, use them as you like. I think with that, I'd like to introduce you all to our headline speaker for tonight, Dr. Tim Mackerel. Tim is a renowned nature conservationist with a passion for studying and preserving wildlife. With a PhD in Osprey Migration, he has dedicated years to exploring the West African region to conduct extensive research on ospreys. Tim's expertise in this field led him to successfully manage the Rutland Osprey Project over a decade. Additionally, he founded the Osprey Leadership Foundation, highlighting his commitment to conservation efforts. Currently, Tim works as a freelance nature conservationist, collaborating with the esteemed Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation. His involvement spans various species recovery projects, including the noteworthy second English Osprey translocation at Poole Harbour in Dorset, as well as the white-tailed eagle introduction on the Isle of Wight. With his vast knowledge and experience, Tim's contributions continue to make a significant impact in the field of wildlife conservation. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Tim Mackerel. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Well, it's great to be here tonight and to share my enthusiasm for Osprey migration. So I'm going to get cracking because I've got 40 minutes and I could probably talk till midnight about it, and I'm sure no one wants me to do that. So I'll get cracking. I'm going to share some of the research. Some of this research is from my PhD. Some of it's from kind of more recently. but basically, I hope that this just gives you an introduction to the amazing migratory capabilities of this species. You know, they really are masters of the air when it comes to migration. So without further ado, we shall get cracking. So this is the osprey. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this bird of prey. It's a really charismatic species, and it's a species which occurs across the globe. So the osprey at different times of the year occurs on every continent except for Antarctica. And it really is their migrations that mean they do have this remarkable cosmopolitan distribution. So if you look at a map of their global distribution, you'll see that they occur through North America, Europe, and also in Australasia. And those northern populations in North America and Europe are migratory. So you can see that the American race, which is Pandinhaliatus carolinensis, migrates on a broad front through North America, through the USA, and then down into Central and Southern America. Then the European birds, which really breed from Britain right across through Scandinavia and into Russia. They migrate south for the winter in the same way. So the Western European birds migrate down to West Africa, and those from further east typically travel through Eastern Europe and then down into Eastern and Southern parts of Africa. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail. But as you can see on that map, you know, as you go further east, there are further migratory populations that migrate down into Southeast Asia. Then the birds in Australasia, they are predominantly sedentary. There are some movements, but essentially they're sedentary. And likewise, birds at lower latitudes in Europe and North America, they tend to be sedentary. So for example, there's sedentary populations in Florida. There's also sedentary populations or populations that just make limited migratory movements in the Mediterranean. Anyway, how do we know all about this? Well, of course, satellite tracking, as I'm sure most of you are aware, has become an incredible tool for the research of migratory birds. And the osprey is one of the species that's been studied extensively, really since the early 2000s, when satellite tracking was still in its infancy. And over those intervening 30 years, the technology, 25 years maybe, the technology really has evolved. So the most recent tags that we're using provide the most incredible detail. You can log a migrating osprey's position literally every few seconds as it flies south now. So the data we have on individual birds as they migrate south really is quite remarkable. And all of the tags that are now fitted are fitted with solar panels, which of course means when you've got a migratory species that's going to sunny places during the winter, the longevity of the tags is excellent. So an individual osprey can be tracked for 5 years or more. And obviously that gives us even more information on how a bird evolves its migratory strategy over its lifetime. And that's something that I'll touch on as we go through the talk. So I'm going to specifically focus on ospreys in Europe, which of course migrate to Africa. And my own research predominantly is birds from northern Scotland and also central England. So I'm going to focus on that. But I thought it was good to just put into context where ospreys in Europe spend the winter. And these are birds from different satellite tracking studies. You can see there that the birds from the UK, the birds I've studied, most of those migrate south through France and Spain, some winter on the Iberia Peninsula in southern Spain or Portugal, but most carry on across the Sahara down into West Africa. So they're going anywhere from southern Mauritania and northern Senegal, right the way down through Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, the Ivory Coast. Then if you go further east in Europe, if you go into eastern Scandinavia, Finland, or if you go further south into Estonia, Lithuania, those birds from further east typically travel south through Eastern Europe, and then they cross the Mediterranean into Africa. Some will then meet up with birds from further Western Europe on the west coast of Africa, whereas others will travel down through eastern parts of Africa, and some individuals will go all the way to the southern coast of South Africa. So there's one satellite tag bird from Finland, which actually isn't on this map, but it migrated to the southern tip of South Africa, which as far as we know is the longest recorded osprey migration. So it's something like 12,000 kilometers. So individual birds do make these remarkable journeys many times over the course of their lifespan. When you think that an osprey might live until it's 20 or maybe even 25 years old, they really do stack up the miles as they get older. So my research predominantly focuses on osprey migration from the UK, and over the years we've followed a really good number of birds, so we've now got a very detailed knowledge of what the ospreys from the UK are doing. And much of that work has been pioneered by Roy Dennis, who I now work with. And Roy satellite tagged his first ospreys in Scotland in 1999, which was the same year we began tracking birds from England. So the database really covers birds right from that period. So in that time, the technology's advanced, and we've got more detailed and higher temporal resolution data. But essentially, our knowledge has really increased hugely over the past 25 years. And the map there on the left-hand side of the screen shows you the migrations of 14 different adult ospreys from Scotland and England down into Southern Europe and West Africa. The orange lines are the autumn journeys, and the white lines are the spring journeys. And basically, those are adult ospreys migrating to and from a known breeding site to a known wintering site. And adult ospreys, as you'll see in a while, will literally go and sit on the same tree in West Africa every single winter. They're incredibly faithful to that same location every year. There's a few subtle differences in route. So we find that in autumn, ospreys from the UK are more likely to make longer sea crossings. So they'll fly across the Bay of Biscay, from direct sometimes from the UK down to northern France, whereas in spring, when they're flying north, when generally the weather's poorer, they stick to land, so they're generally migrating up the Atlantic coast of France. And in terms of how far they fly every day, well, it does vary slightly between the seasons. So as I mentioned, in autumn, typically the weather in Europe at least is more favourable. So on average, the birds on that map travel 280 kilometres per day during autumn, whereas in spring they're travelling slightly less, about 241 kilometres. And that's mainly because in autumn the weather conditions, and particularly the winds, tend to be more favourable. Often in the spring, those birds were flying north into northerly headwinds, and that really does slow their progress up. Now, one of the great things about the data that we've got is that we've been able to follow really experienced adult ospreys on migration. The difference between adults and juveniles is quite stark, as you'll see in a minute. But I think the fascinating thing about adult birds is that they really know what they're doing. So they're basically migrating from a known breeding site where they've probably reared young down to a wintering site that they first established as a juvenile. And at Osprey Nest, there's a fairly predictable process of departure. So the adult female will generally go first, and she'll migrate once her young have fledged. Some stay later, but many adult ospreys will leave perhaps a couple of weeks after their chicks have left the nest. But the adult male, he stays at the nest site to provision the young until they leave on migration. When the juveniles leave, they migrate on their own, but the adult male remains with them at the nest until they leave, and that ensures that those youngsters are in the best possible condition for when they set off on their first migration south. And what that can mean is that some adult males have to stay quite a long for longer than their partners. So in some cases, males will stay on the breeding grounds for a month later than the bird that they reared chicks with. And what we tend to find is that those birds that do stay on the breeding grounds for longer because they've got young who are reluctant to leave, they typically, or quite often, will undertake really long flights at the beginning of their autumn migration. And the best example we've got is this bird, Blue XD, who was a bird who bred in northern Scotland near Aviemore for a number of years, and Roy Dennis fitted this tag to this bird when it was an adult male, and breeding successfully. And this particular year, he left the nest site on the 10th of September and picked the perfect day to migrate. So clear skies, there was a full moon and northwesterly wind, so a nice tailwind for a migration south. And the bird flew direct from its nest site in northern Scotland that it left 7:03 on the 10th of September, and it continued flying for 36 hours until it made landfall in Extremadura in central Spain at 6:45 the next evening, so the 11th of September. So a non-stop flight. You'll see there was part of that flight was across the Bay of Biscay from the Brittany Peninsula in France down to the north coast of Spain. But that is a bird who picked the absolute optimum conditions to leave and then made a really fast start to its migration. So 2,001 kilometers in just under 36 hours. And that migration route is pretty typical for adult ospreys in winter. They typically will fly across the Bay of Biscay to northern Spain. And those birds that leave late will often migrate quite quickly and make a fast start to their journey. And the reason is that basically they want to reclaim their winter territory. So we know from the satellite tracking data that they will go and perch on exactly the same stretch of coastline, exactly the same mangrove every single winter. And adult birds will actually be quite territorial of that wintering site, their favoured roosting site. So they'll regularly chase juveniles, newly arrived juveniles, away from those spots. And so we think that the reason these later departing birds do make these long flights at the beginning of their southward migration is simply because they're keen to get down to reclaim their winter territory. So just as a bird is keen to get back to its nest site in the spring, then so adult ospreys, it makes sense for them to make a timely arrival at their wintering site because they're going back to an area they know well, and that obviously is key to their winter survival. Now, the other thing that the most recent satellite tags has enabled us to do is not just understand where the ospreys are migrating, but actually how they're migrating. You know, what proportion of the day they're spending migrating, and actually how they're flying. So where we have satellite tags with accelerometers, it means that we can ground truth data and basically determine how the birds are flying when they're airborne. And what that's shown us is that basically the osprey is a bird which takes a really flexible approach to its migration. So whereas some birds are some migrating raptors are totally reliant on thermal updrafts to aid their migration, so they're soaring migrants and they're always sticking to land. Ospreys are more adaptable, so they can fly long periods using powered flapping flight, but they can also utilize soaring gliding flight. And one of the periods or parts of the migration where we know that soaring gliding flight is really important is when they're crossing the Sahara, because of course for a fish eating, ospreys are exclusively piscivorous, so fish is 100% of the diet. And so when European ospreys are migrating across the Sahara, they're typically going for maybe 4, 5, 6 days without food. So it's important at that point for them to really minimize energy expenditure. And so what we've seen as the birds cross the Sahara, essentially they limit their daily flight times to periods when thermal updrafts are available. So they'll perhaps not begin migrating until 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and then they'll carry on till about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. And this video just shows you a short stretch of Blue XD, so the bird I've just talked about, his migration across the Sahara, and his tag was logging the bird's location every minute. And so I've here just basically showing a three-dimensional view of his flight across the Sahara. And what that's showing you is basically that typical pattern of soaring gliding flight, where the bird catches a thermal updraft, circles up, and then glides forward. And that is the typical flight profile of an osprey as it migrates across the Sahara. So you get that very characteristic flight profile. And by doing so, the birds will readily fly 250, 300, maybe even 400 kilometers across the desert. And interestingly, when they are crossing the desert, despite the fact they could choose to follow the coast, basically the adult birds prefer to make the most direct crossing of the desert. So rather than making a longer flight around the sea, around the coast, and perhaps fishing at sea, they basically fly direct across the desert towards the fish-rich wintering grounds in West Africa, or at least if you're a bird from the UK. But that's not to say that they can't migrate by other means. So basically, the morphology of the osprey, and I'm just going to go forward to the next slide quickly. The morphology of the osprey basically means that they are able to take this kind of flexible approach to migration. So they've got very long, narrow wings. And what that means is that they can undertake long periods of flapping flight without using too much energy. And there was an interesting study a few years ago, Agostini et al. 2015, where they looked at the water crossing capabilities of raptors. And basically what they concluded by looking at different elements of the bird's wings, so things like aspect ratio, wing loading, they calculated basically how far those birds should be able to cross, or how far they should be able to fly across areas of open water. You'll know that, you know, the large species like griffon vulture actively avoid crossing long areas of open ocean. But a bird like the osprey, because of its morphology, it's basically well adapted to making long sea crossings. So you can see there that the osprey that I've highlighted has one of the best water crossing kind of capabilities of any raptor within Europe. And what that means is that basically, as they fly south, they can make long flights across the sea. So it's not unusual for a bird to fly from southern England all the way down to northern Spain. And one of the things that we found that they're able to do as they're crossing the sea, and particularly in autumn when sea surface temperatures are warmer, you sometimes get rising columns of air over the sea, just like you do over land. So these are kind of updrafts that are not as strong as thermals over land, but basically the osprey, because of its morphology, is able to, in some cases, achieve soaring gliding flight over the sea. So they're not necessarily, when they're flying over the sea, they're not necessarily just flying by powered flapping flight. They can undertake soaring gliding flight. So as an example here, you can see that this is three different views of the same period of time. So between 1019 and 1025 on that on this cross section, you can see that the bird increased its altitude from 180 meters up to 466 meters, and then glided forward. So that kind of flight profile is very similar to the flight of the bird over the Sahara. So it's really fascinating to see how even over the sea, the osprey's morphology enables it to achieve soaring gliding flight sometimes. Other times, they're basically migrating by flapping flight. And because of the shape of the wings, they're basically able to undertake, you know, they can in some cases fly 1,500 kilometers without a break across the sea. Now, obviously, if you're going to talk about bird migration, then one of the key things you talk about is the wind, because the wind has an absolutely profound effect on bird migration. And a migrating bird can basically adapt to or react to winds in different ways. And crosswinds in particular can cause problems for migrating birds. So I've got three diagrams here that basically show you how a bird might adapt to crosswinds that it encounters on its migration. So if it allows itself to be drifted by the wind, then basically what that means is that the crosswind will blow the bird off course. If it compensates for the wind, then the bird changes its heading so that it basically compensates for the crosswind and maintains the absolute optimal migration track it wants to. Or in some cases, it might overcompensate and change its heading so much that even with that crosswind, it basically is still not going in quite the right direction. So wind drift, compensation, and overcompensation are three different ways a migrating bird can react to, or otherwise, to the wind. And that's particularly pertinent when you look at the migrations of juveniles, because the big difference between juvenile and adult ospreys is that juveniles are not migrating to a known place. So a juvenile osprey is basically migrating from its natal nest site to some distant wintering grounds. Now, unlike an adult, it's not got a known place it's going to. So basically what it's doing is it's migrating in essentially an inherited direction. So we think that young ospreys find their way by a process known as vector summation, which is where they're basically flying a certain distance for a certain length of time, and that is taking them, roughly speaking, in the direction they want to go for the winter. So taking the UK Ospreys as an example, instinctively those birds will migrate southwest, because if you draw a straight line from northern Scotland, as is the case here, down to West Africa, you have to migrate southwest. So the birds from the UK have a tendency to go southwest, and that, as you can see, can cause problems, particularly in autumns when you get a prevalence of easterly crosswinds. Because if you think about it, if you're migrating southwest naturally and you meet easterly crosswinds and you're an juvenile osprey who's not done the migration before, you're not going to know that you need to compensate for those crosswinds. So what we see is that adult ospreys, when they need to, they're able to compensate for crosswinds and they maintain the correct heading. But juveniles, if they meet crosswinds, they're very often blown out to sea and can be lost. And as an example, actually, this last spring, we got a most incredible record of a Scottish Osprey, which was ringed last year in Barbados. So it actually crossed the Atlantic, and it was probably because of, or probably did a migration very similar to this bird. So this is a bird which we called Stan, which again was a bird that Roy Dennis tagged at its nest in Murray in northern Scotland. And you'll see here that it did an incredible 8-day migration to Cape Verde via the Canary Islands. And this bird basically set off from Scotland and it headed down through England, through Western England, and down across the Brittany Peninsula and across the Bay of Biscay into Spain and then Portugal. And then after about 4 days of migration, it was already in the southwest tip of Portugal. Now, if that was an adult osprey, then that would basically recognize that it was going off track and it would compensate even if it met easterly winds, and it would fly back to the Moroccan coast. But this bird was basically, as you can see here, it was migrating southwest, but there were easterly winds. And so those easterly winds had already pushed it further west in Portugal. And when it left the Portuguese coast to go further south, it basically continued on that same southwesterly track rather than compensating. And that meant it had to fly 980 kilometers non-stop to the Canary Islands. So it did that. It flew from Portugal to Lanzarote in 25 hours and then spent about the next day hopping between the different islands in the Canaries. And then at that point, again, if it was an adult osprey, then maybe it would fly back to the African mainland. But no, it continued on that same southwesterly heading, and this time it had even further to fly across the sea. So now it flew southwest and it flew non-stop for 33 hours until it got to Cape Verde. So 1,542 kilometers in 33 hours before it made landfall. So just 8 days after leaving its nest site in Scotland, it had reached the Cape Verde Islands. Now, we were really fascinated to see what it would do next. Would it remain on those islands or would it continue? Well, sadly, after a few days of just staying in the Cape Verdes, the tag stopped sending data. And we think that the likelihood is that the reason it stopped sending data is the bird probably continued southwest and then drowned at sea. We'll never know. But there is a chance that, maybe the tag stopped transmitting data and possibly that bird remained there, because there's been some really interesting genetic studies which have shown that the population in Cape Verde is very closely related to those in Northern Europe. And so it could be that population, which is sedentary, it basically was founded by vagrants from Northern Europe. So Stan perhaps gives you a glimpse into the past and to what some of those ospreys did to establish that population there. And what that meant is that the distances Stan was flying on migration were far, far more than most osprey does in a single day. So that bird was averaging over 1,000 kilometers per sector of migration. So sector is essentially a day's flying. Now, in his case, obviously, in some cases, he was flying more than a day per migratory sector. But basically, what that shows you is it was an exceptional migration. It's more typical for both adult and juvenile ospreys to fly somewhere in the region of 200 to 400 kilometers per day. Now, as I alluded to earlier, one of the other things that we've been able to learn about ospreys is how the experiences on their first migration influence subsequent journeys. And we do that because where you've got a bird that's been followed for a number of years, you can really understand how they're making decisions and how they're learning from experience. And the best example we have from the UK is this bird, Rothymercus, who was tagged by Roy in 2009. And on his first migration, he did this very similar to Stan, flew southwest during easterly winds and basically made a long flight over the Bay of Biscay. So he basically flew for 1,300 kilometers in 33 hours before making landfall in Portugal. And we know that off the Spanish coast there, he actually landed on a boat before flying to the Spanish mainland and then flying into Portugal. So, you know, a very tough start to his migration. And he then stayed in Portugal for a month before continuing south and eventually reaching Juge National Park in northern Senegal. And it took him 47 days to get there, but actually only 13 traveling days and 34 stopover days, the majority of which were on the Rio Pava in Portugal. Now, he then remained in West Africa for the next 18 months, which is what most ospreys would do. Eventually established a wintering site, which I'm going to mention again in a minute, and then flew north again. And the interesting thing here, that northward migration is red and the first journey is orange. You can see that his northward migration is quite similar. So you can see that he flew to Galicia coast in northern Spain, not that far from where he made landfall after that long flight across the Bay of Biscay. And then after a stopover in Galicia for 9 days, he flew back across the Bay of Biscay and amazingly made landfall near Poole Point in Dorset at almost exactly the point that he had departed from in September 2009. So there's no doubt that he had was basing that northward journey on his first experiences of migration as a juvenile. Now, the most fascinating aspect was what then happened on his second autumn migration. So 2011, he'd flown north for the first time. He spent the summer exploring Scotland, which is typical of a 2-year-old osprey, and then flew south. And you can see there that rather than flying across the Bay of Biscay, he went down through the Atlantic coast along the Atlantic coast of France. And normally an adult osprey that, you know, knows where it's going is then going to continue down towards the Strait of Gibraltar and across the Sahara down into West Africa. But obviously this bird, having stopped over in Galicia the previous spring, wanted to get back there. But having had 2 very long, arduous crossings of the Bay of Biscay, didn't want to fly across the Bay of Biscay. So did this incredible dogleg migration to get to Galicia and then he did another stopover very close to that same estuary. Then when he continued his journey again, interestingly, he basically reached the same point in southwestern Portugal where he had flown as a juvenile and then flew out to sea again. Now, the interesting thing here is that he did that when there were easterly winds, got blown out into the Atlantic. But here you can see, as an adult, that bird knows to compensate for those crosswinds and did actually make it back onto the African mainland and then down to that same wintering site in Senegal. So already on just its second autumn migration, you can see how that bird is learning from experience. Now, the reality for many ospreys is that they simply don't make their first migration. So I looked at 35 juvenile ospreys that we satellite tagged in England and Scotland, and you can see here that only 51% completed their first migration. So we know that of the birds that didn't, some we were unsure of because of tag failure, but at least a third of the birds that set off died on that first migration. So it is an incredibly hazardous time for those juvenile ospreys. But even once they get onto wintering grounds, then it's not that simple for the juveniles. And one of the reasons it's not that simple for the juveniles is because the adult birds are there in the best places. So as an example, here are 2 adults that we satellite tagged at Rutland Water and their migrations to Senegal. So 0998 was a male and 3005 a female, and we tagged them both as adults. So we don't know what they did as juveniles, but as adults they did these really fast migrations. So you can see that 30 got to her wintering site on the Senegalese coast in just 12 days and 09 took 16 days. And you can see here the average straightness 0.96. So basically, 1 is a direct straight line from the breeding site to the wintering site. So 30's average or straightness of that migration route was 0.96. So an incredibly direct route, and 09 0.94. So these are birds that know exactly where they're going, and they're not messing about. They want to get back to that wintering site that they know so well. And remarkably, this is totally by chance. These two birds, which nested not that far away in Rutland, actually migrated to the same part of the Senegalese coast on the an area of coastline called the Grand Coast between Dakar and St. Louis. And you can see that they migrated to two places just a few kilometers apart. Probably never saw each other in winter, though, because basically what we know from this satellite tracking is not only do adult ospreys go back to the same place every winter, but once they get there, they're remarkably sedentary. So basically they're sitting on the same beach every day, flying out to sea once or twice a day, and then doing very little else. And this part of the Senegalese coastline is incredibly important for ospreys from Northern Europe. And this is a photo taken by my colleague John Wright. In fact, most of these photos are taken by John. He's a really fantastic photographer. And this just shows you the ospreys in that photo. I don't know how many there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 birds, or thereabouts. They're nearly all adult birds, and these are birds that will go and sit on the same bit of coastline every winter. And we know that as the European osprey population has been increasing, so have the number of ospreys wintering on this part of the coastline. So if you compare the most recent census data, which was compiled by a French ornithologist, Jean-Marie Dupart, who lives in Senegal, he, on a survey in 2022, logged over 350 ospreys on that part of the coastline, compared to less than 100 when Prevost did a similar census back in the early 80s. So you can really see how these birds have become more and more numerous on that coast of Africa, and they have to be tolerant of each other. So although they'll chase juveniles away, the adults are often very tolerant of each other because they get to know their neighbours, who they see every year. Now, sadly, 09, on the second year that we followed him, we didn't know whether he returned. Well, he didn't return to that wintering site because he actually died on migration. And I just wanted to show you this, just because it was quite incredible that we got some data which showed that he was roosting on a ridge on the northern edge of the Sahara. And at that point, the data was coming in every 3 days. So 3 days later, I expected the bird to be well across its crossing of the Sahara. But sadly, what we found is that the bird was still transmitting from exactly the same location. So at that point, you think, well, the tag's either come off or the bird has died. And so I put out an appeal on the internet to see if there was anyone relatively local. There's not going to be anyone too local in the Sahara, but anyone living in Morocco who might be able to go and look. And would you believe, within a few hours, a guy, Farid Laquar, had offered to drive down from his home in Agadir to go and look for this bird. And Farid basically packed a rucksack. He drove 5 hours south from his home, packed a rucksack, took his satellite phone, some supplies, and trekked up onto this ridge on the northern edge of the Sahara. And he actually found the remains of 09. And we think that he was probably predated while he was roosting on that ridge. So although we know that adult ospreys, probably 90%, return every year, once they've refined their migration route, their chances of survival increase so much more. But even an adult osprey is not immune to, just natural hazards that they encounter on migration. So this bird was roosting on this ridge, and quite often when they're in the desert, they're roosting on the ground, so they're vulnerable to ground predators and also avian predators. And this bird was taken, and we think possibly by a desert eagle owl, while it was roosting on that ridge. But I thought it was incredible that Farid was able to go and discover what had happened so quickly. Now we know that basically adult ospreys are migrating to known wintering sites, and we know there are certain hotspots in Africa. So I'm about 5 minutes off finishing my talk, so hopefully I'm keeping to time. But basically, I've been fortunate to go out to the west coast of Africa for several winters to go and look at ospreys on their wintering grounds. And one of the best places I've been to is the Saloum Delta in Senegal, which is a fantastic place, a huge area of just shallow water and mangroves, and it's a real hotspot for wintering ospreys from Northern Europe. And on our field trips into the Delta, we've encountered numerous colouring birds from Europe. So not necessarily satellite tag birds, but certainly colouring birds. And just as an example, I've been to this place a number of times, and we regularly make a boat trip from Masira, which is inland within the Delta, out to an island off the coast, which is called Ile d'Oiseau. And it's very well named because there's huge breeding colony of Caspian terns and other species, but it's also somewhere a safe place for ospreys to go and winter. And you can see really good numbers of birds on the sandy island there, and they're again remarkably tolerant of each other, although juveniles are quite often chased away. But you can see, up to 14, 15 birds sometimes sitting together on those sandy islands. And we were able to identify birds from all over the place, from Germany, Scotland, England, Latvia, France. So a whole range of different colouring ospreys. But from our point of view, I was traveling with a group from Rutland, and what we were really hoping is that we might bump into one of the ospreys that we'd colouringed in Rutland. And there was one particular day when we were out in a boat on the Delta, and John was we saw an osprey perched in the mangroves, which is not unusual. That's a typical place for them to sit. And when that bird took off, John Wright took some photos, and we could see that it had a blue colouring on the right leg, and that meant it was a bird that had been probably colouringed in either Wales or England. But the bird flew off before we could read the ring. So we went back the next evening, and the bird was perched in exactly the same place as you would expect. We got closer, and John managed to get this photo, and it showed that the ring number was 32, which was a bird from Rutland Water, which was fantastic. I was so excited I nearly capsized the boat, but it was just a really brilliant moment. And when we went back to the same place 3 years later, sure enough, there was 32 in exactly the same location at his established wintering site. So the site fidelity of these adult ospreys is really quite remarkable. So for the adults, they're basically going to a wintering site they know every year, and they fly direct there. For juveniles, it's much more difficult to establish a wintering site, but because of this long-term satellite tracking, we now have been able to get a really good insight into how they do that. And I'm going to just finish the talk by talking about how Rothymercus found his wintering site. So you'll recall that he did a 43-day migration to Djoudj National Park up in northern Senegal. And this is, again, another place I've visited. And it's a fantastic place for not just ospreys, but a huge number of different wetland species. I mean, this photo is not Rothymercus, it's a German colouringed osprey, but you can see there it's surrounded by gargony. And to just put this photo into context, the peak count of gargony we'd had at Rutland Water before this trip was 5. So to see this bird just surrounded by literally thousands of gargony was just an incredible sight. But it's not surprising, because this is a vast wetland on the north, basically the southern edge of the Sahara. So it's the first wetland that many migrating species encounter once they cross the desert, and many just stop there for the winter. There's also a huge number of other species. So that osprey there has got a massive flock of white-faced whistling ducks in the background. It's a fantastic place. Anyway, Rothymercus stayed there for several months. And ospreys often do that. You think, well, that's a suitable wintering site. Why didn't he stay there? But he didn't. He then wandered further south in January. And you can see here that after 3 months at Djoudj, he went further south into the Saloum Delta. Now, interestingly, if you compare his movements around the Saloum Delta to where I've just described, he kind of steered clear of the areas where you get the big numbers of adult birds, probably because he was simply chased away from them. So he was pushed further inland in the Delta, where conditions aren't quite so good for the ospreys. And eventually, after wandering around a huge area, 1,400 square kilometres, he then moved further southeast down to a tributary of the River Gambia, so just in Senegal, just north of the Gambia border. And he settled there from March onwards. So having arrived in October, this was now the following March. And you can see here that he then remained at that location for the rest of summer 2010. So that's his first or second summer, having hatched in 2009. And interestingly, as that summer progressed, his home range basically contracted. So it went down to just 1 kilometre square by the autumn. And so what had happened is that that bird had basically found a wintering site. So after these fairly extensive wanderings in Senegal, he'd basically settled on a place to call his winter home. And as you'll recall, in May 2011, he flew north for the first time. And then the next winter, when he came back to West Africa, he went back to exactly the same place. So Wight is 2010, and then the following winter is Red. So you can really see how that bird has learnt that that is the place he's going to call his wintering site. And myself and John and some colleagues from Rutland Water went there in January 2012, and we actually saw Rothiemurcus at his wintering site, which was fantastic. And even at that point, he was still having a kind of dispute with another adult osprey. So you can see that, you know, even at that point, as a bird who is now more established, there were still these kind of territorial squabbles. And that really is what underpins that autumn migration and the urgency to get to their wintering grounds. So I could go on for a lot longer, but I've tried to keep to time, which I think I've done. So thank you very much for listening. If you want to know more about Osprey migration, have a look at the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation website, roydennis.org. And I've also founded another charity, Osprey LF, which is basically it's using the migration of the osprey as kind of a flagship, and to show how the birds like ospreys can link people across international divides. And we're working with young people in countries along the Osprey flyway to help them to become basically the conservation leaders of the future. So you can read more about that on our website, ospreylf.org. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Tim, thank you so much for that. That presentation was fantastic. It is truly a fascinating species. It's always so amazing to see those tracks from all migrating raptors, but specifically from ospreys. Very, very cool to see. I see there are tons of questions coming through, which is fantastic. We love it. Keep them coming in. Think of more. But before we get to them, we're going to head from West Africa all the way to East Africa to visit with Faith and Justice to chat a little bit about raptors from a guiding perspective at Lake Naivasha.
Hello, hi everyone. My name is Justice. I was first introduced to nature by the compact disc my father bought on wildlife documentaries back when I was in class 3. I mostly liked the parts where the cheetahs could hunt their prey, of which later on I learned to be the Thompson gazelles. Actually, till now, cheetahs are my favorite animals. How they are fast, their streamlined body and flexibility is fascinating. This led me to pursue a wildlife course at Wildlife Research and Training Institute, where my birding experience now began. Getting a few concepts on birds intrigued me to learn more, where superb starling were the first birds I knew by name, being one of the most common birds around Naivasha. Actually, I liked how the scientific name of the bird sounded, Lamprotonis superbus, because for me it was like joining 3 different names of motor vehicle, that is Lamborghini, a Subaru and a bus. At the beginning of my bird watching journey, I could only name birds in a general term like eagles or weavers, and others I could do in a local language. I remember very well waking up every Saturday morning at 6 a.m. for a 3 hours bird watching session, where I proudly served as their chairperson in the year 2019 to 2020. Actually, it's really amazing to see the club become one of the best and the biggest clubs in Wildlife Research and Training Institute now.
Lake Naivasha is one of the Ramsar sites in Kenya, harboring many different bird species. Crescent Island Game Sanctuary, being surrounded by Lake Naivasha, is not exceptional. Working here in Crescent Island has been very fulfilling in terms of birds and other animals. I got very intrigued by the fish eagles on the island because other than having great hunting skills, their numbers has thrived well because of the extra food they get from the boat operators who throw fish to them. Mostly you'll find that they nest during the peak season, that is July to August, when they get the extra food to feed their chicks. This is possible because of the presence of the abundant fish in the lake. The best part of my work, I can say, has been monitoring animals and some of the nest of the fish eagles on the island. Actually, protecting and conserving nature for a better world is therefore all in our hands. Cutting down trees, clearing of bushes, poisoning, drying up of some ponds, among others, are the major threats to animals, mostly birds. Therefore, it is a worldwide call for each and every person to embrace, participate, and join hands in conservation. If each one of us contributes their own bit, then the difference will be tremendous. Thank you for your time.
Growing up, I was very outgoing. I spent most days lost in nature. Nature has somehow always been a safe space for me, especially the tall jacaranda tree that grew outside our home. I was always looking forward to its blooming season. I remember laying down under the jacaranda tree while admiring the birds. It felt so serene and magical. My name is Faith Airobi and I am a conservationist at heart. Growing up, I remember continuously scolding my older male friends who used to hunt down birds using a catapult. Back then, I had no basis or hard facts as to why they should stop hunting, except for that it was wrong to break the bird's family apart. I in turn will get mocked for desperately trying to save birds that I could not even name, birds that were not even familiar with me. These words were said to me by my friends and they would hit a nerve each time. Looking back at that moment now, that is where my conservation journey began. I grew up a curious child, annoyingly so, I must say. I believe I still am. The desire to learn and understand what nature holds has always enabled me to pursue that curiosity in me. Undertaking an environmental course at university reinforced my passion for wildlife and birds. I actively participated in the conservation projects and birdwatching clubs, which really enabled me to grow as a young conservationist. While being equipped with plenty of knowledge in school is very essential, being on the ground and experiencing the reality of everything you studied is a different experience altogether. I have never felt more connected to nature. Truly, when we look deep into the lenses of nature, we acquire a deeper perspective and a better understanding of the world. Working as a safari tour guide on Crescent Island in Lake Naivasha has been refreshing and an exciting experience for me. The island is home to various wild animals and several avian species. Not forgetting the breathtaking scenery where you get to see a 360 view of the Lake Naivasha. I get to observe, learn, and share knowledge on wildlife on the island. The best part about working in the wildlife field has to be the interactions bit. The interaction with wild animals and nature in its own purest form, and the interaction with tourists. In Jane Goodall's words, only if we care Only if we understand will we care, and only if we care will we help. Getting to educate people all over the world on wildlife, its importance to the environment, and making them understand the need to preserve it is revolutionary to me. Joining educational sites like this one, the Share Screen Africa, where I am learning and interacting with professionals from most parts of the world, facilitates my growth as a young conservationist. I love raptors. I find them to be very intriguing and fascinating birds that we will probably ever see. Monitoring my favorite one yet, the African fish eagle, has been a great honor. It has been a beautiful experience to watch them thrive in this unique ecosystem. Watching the fish eagles in close proximity as they catch the fish thrown at them is one of my peak moments here. The Marshall eagles really stand out to me as well. I am amazed by their strength and binocular vision. I love how relatively quiet but powerful they are. Sounds like me. Actively taking part in conservation activities on the island, like ghost net removal on Lake Naivasha, plays a crucial role in ensuring the healthy state of the lake and the preservation of aquatic life, since the fish eagles' survival depends on the health of the two. While my childhood friends might have been right about birds not being familiar with me, I am familiar with them, I know them, and I know that they matter. I will continue to care for the birds around me by protecting and preserving their habitats.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to Faith and Justice for showing us their life in not only the conservation industry, but the guiding industry, which is also where a lot of our students actually end up and find their path taking them. So thank you again to all our speakers, Tim, Faith, Justice. It's fantastic hearing from you. We've come to the part of our session that that I enjoy quite a lot, and that's chatting to our audience. We've already got a few questions in the chat. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do it a couple ways. Either you can go ahead, click on the reactions button at the bottom and say raise your hand so we know that you have a question. And then you can, once we call your name out, just unmute yourself and ask your question. Otherwise, just put your question in the chat and we'll get to it as we go along. So I think let's kick it off. I think, Tim, there's quite a few questions for you. Emmanuel has a couple. First of all, he wants to know whether your tracking data, your tracking information is readily available on an open source platform. And to follow up with that, how do you share the information with different and relevant government and non-governmental organizations or agencies to help them support global efforts towards sustainable conservation of osprey?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Most of the data, or certainly a summary of the data that I've shown tonight, is on the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation website, and also a lot of osprey satellite tracking data. Not all of these birds, but a lot of satellite tracking data is on MoveBank. So MoveBank's a fantastic resource for looking at the migration tracks of many different species, including ospreys. But roydennis.org is one place to look. The thing regarding sharing data is a really important one because a species like the osprey is almost a flagship for many of our migratory birds. So we know that many Western Palearctic migrants do similar migrations to the osprey, and many of the wetland sites they visit become incredibly important places for a range of different species. And I think it's something that we really need to get better at sharing that data with local NGOs and so forth. And there was a project you may have heard of, the Flight of the Osprey, which was done by an organisation called Conservation Without Borders, which is based in the UK. It's led by Sasha Dench, who's an ambassador for migratory birds. And Sasha basically did the migration of an osprey, followed it overland. She's a paramotor pilot, but unfortunately she had an accident and wasn't able to fly the migration, but she did it overland. And one of the things she was really trying to do was to raise awareness of migration, of osprey migration, but making really strong links with different organizations along the flyway. And I think that was quite important. So I think it's something that, you know, we really must develop better, because, you know, international collaboration is so important for the protection of migratory species. And as I said, I think the osprey is a real flagship for that.
Yeah, and I think I'm not too sure if you mentioned it, Tim. There is a website called MoveBank
Yes.
where a lot of data is put up. Is your Osprey work on that platform?
No, it's not yet, but it will be. So we're planning to put it on there, because I think it's such a valuable resource, that is. And if you look on there, you can actually find quite a lot of the existing studies that are there that followed ospreys on migration. So yeah, I think MoveBank's a brilliant resource for migration studies generally.
Yeah, I mean, I actually bring it up because I've just used some data from MoveBank in my own raptor thesis that I'm doing. So a fantastic resource that anybody interested in migration in general is probably a good resource to jump onto. I think we'll see if we can get a link up in the chat for people that are interested to go and do a little bit of investigation of their own. The next question is from Arnold. There's a time an osprey was identified in Kenya around Lake Victoria region. The collar reads, I assume he means the tracking harness, reads Finland when traced. What could have caused this? And do ospreys use magnetic field lines for migration purposes?
Yeah, another great question. Well, interestingly, Arnold, the Finnish ospreys are quite intriguing, because they basically do. There's two main flyways they use. So some of them will do a western route, much like the birds I've talked about from the UK. But some Finnish birds go down through East Africa. So quite a few satellite tag birds from Finland have wintered in Kenya. And then further south through East Africa and right down to in one case, the southern coast of South Africa. So those birds from further east in Europe, from Finland, from Estonia, from Lithuania, places like that, most of those birds will be going down through the eastern part of Africa and to countries like Kenya. And basically, we don't know exactly how ospreys navigate. We think it's a range of different factors. So that initial journey, as I touched on in my talk, is very instinctive. And the interesting thing is that the birds will obviously inherit their migratory tendency from their parents and successive generations before them. And one really good example is that Swedish ospreys use a southwesterly route on migration, whereas Finnish birds typically go more east. But there was one Finnish bird, or a bird that was tagged in Finland, who originated from Sweden. And when she migrated, she went southwest, whereas her partner did the typical eastern route for a Finnish bird. So basically, the birds are migrating on instinct, on an inherited tendency to go either southwest if you're from Western Europe, or perhaps more southeast if you're from somewhere like Finland. And the adult birds probably use a range of different factors. So we think it could be magnetic fields, could also be visual cues on migration. There's a particular ridge that goes southwest across the northern edge of the Sahara. And when you look at the satellite tracking data, it's amazing how many birds follow that ridge. And they're probably following it because it guides them away from guides them in the correct direction, but it also they'll be using lift off that hillside as they go south, so orographic lift. So yeah, it's basically a range of different factors, but I think the really fascinating thing is to see what fantastic navigators these adult ospreys are. They're migrating to a known place, and one of the things that I find particularly interesting is that basically they're able to compensate for crosswinds, but they only compensate for those crosswinds at certain points in the journey. So when they're at the beginning of migration, when they're a long way from their final destination, they will basically allow themselves to be drifted by the wind. So they could end up, using quite differing routes from year to year. But then on their migration route, they'll have several places, intermediate goal areas that they go through on every successive migration that they basically learn on that first journey. And they'll navigate towards that. So they might have to compensate for crosswinds as they approach that place. And then likewise, as they get back to their nest, then they'll compensate for crosswinds if they have to. So they really are able to adapt their migration according to different factors that they experience en route. So yeah, they're an amazing species in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. The next question is from Georgia Wells. Every talk by Tim is so great. Well done, Tim. I do have a question. Why do some ospreys change track and overwinter in Spain or Portugal instead of going down to Africa?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you, Georgia. That's very kind of you to say so. What we're finding is that an increasing number of ospreys are wintering in southern Spain and Portugal, and that could be related to climate change. That could be one reason. But also, if you basically, the Sahara is one of the areas where the highest mortality occurs. So we know that birds that cross the Sahara will often die in the desert on their first migration. It's basically, for ospreys from the UK at least, it's the Sahara Desert and the Bay of Biscay that are the two places where mortality mainly occurs. So you would expect probably that birds that are wintering in Spain and Portugal will be selected for because their survival is likely to be higher. So there's a kind of increasing tendency within the population to winter there. And then when you factor in climate change and perhaps that birds can winter further north because the winters are milder, that's maybe a factor as well.
All right. The next question we have here, Emmanuel, yeah, we will definitely thanks for the information. And Dr. Tim, please promise to make sure most of the data will be uploaded online platforms. So that'll be great if it can get to MoveBank. I'm sure Tim will make a plan to do that. The next question is from Darcy Ogata. Good to see you online, Darcy. Great presentation. Do ospreys mostly overwinter along coasts? Firstly, what percentage overwinter at freshwater sites? And then, do coastal breeding ospreys always overwinter along coastlines, or is there no such relationship?
Yeah, interesting. They're a very adaptable species. So what we find is that birds that say breed in the boreal forests of northern Scandinavia, breed around freshwater lakes, then they will readily winter on the coast in West Africa. So there's no real relationship there. But within most of the areas where ospreys are wintering in Africa, they're typically along the coast. That's where the prime wintering sites are. But there are some places where they'll winter around inland lakes. So, Kenya being one example, but also places like we've had birds from England which have wintered in the Ivory Coast around inland lakes. So, yeah, there's a bit of both, but coastal areas typically will hold the highest densities of wintering ospreys.
All right, thanks for that, Tim. I see Holly, you have your hand up. Good to see you online. Don't you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm climbed up a hill on the side of Lake Tanganyika, especially to hear your talk, Tim. And I'm so glad you spoke. Once again, I second Georgia. Incredible. And I have two questions for you. The first one is, how closely do osprey tolerate humans? Because what's the development like in some of those wetland sites in Senegal? And my second question relates to the breeding pairs. And I don't think you mentioned this in this talk. And I do just want for the students who are in on this talk to know, the pairs breed together mostly for life, I understand. So do they come back together at their place in Scotland or in England? And how do they do that? Back to the same nest, same tree? How do they find each other again?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Nice to talk to you. Yeah, the osprey is an interesting life cycle because basically they will pair for life. So if you get a pair of ospreys breeding at a nest site, they will remain faithful to that nest site and that partner every year. But they've at that point when they find a mate and they find a nest site, they've already established a wintering site. So when the female departs, and she's typically the one who goes first, she'll leave, say, mid-August. She'll fly to her wintering site, and that might be on the Senegal coast, or it could, if it's a Finnish osprey, it could be in Kenya, for example. And the male, he'll stay until the chicks depart, and then he'll go to his place. So wherever that is, wherever he first ended up on his first migration, and that really, as you've seen, is largely chance and the kind of weather conditions they experience en route. But then the next spring, they will both return to the same nest. So they can breed together for 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, but only ever see their mate for half the year. So the time when they're at the nest site, but for the rest of the year, they live a very kind of solitary existence. And the second part of your question was to do with development and, how ospreys tolerate human activity. In some parts of the world, they're incredibly habituated to humans. So, for example, on the coast of North America, for example, they nest on all sorts of anthropogenic structures, whether they be mobile phone masts or kind of floodlights on a sports stadium. They very much live alongside people. And we're seeing that in Europe, they're starting to become more habituated to people as well. And likewise on the wintering grounds, when I've seen them in West Africa, then they tolerate predictable disturbance. So when they, seeing people doing the same things every day, they get used to it. But I think there is a concern about development on some parts of the West African coast. And actually, I think one of my biggest concerns relates to overfishing relating to the fish meal industry. So in Gambia, for example, there are 3 new fish meal factories, which are all Chinese owned. And there are worries that is leading to depletion of fish stocks, not just for ospreys, but potentially for, the human population as well. So that to me is a worrying trend that could become an issue, not just for ospreys, but for a range of piscivorous species as well. So it's certainly something to be kind of wary of. And likewise, tourism development in some parts of the coast is likely to remove wintering habitat. So despite the fact they can be habituated to humans, the fact is that if you're removing areas of coastal forests, which are good roosting sites and places like that, that will have a detrimental impact. So yeah, there is a potential issue there.
Thanks, Tim. And just to come on to that, one of the things that I've been to Aviemore, and I just found it incredible that you can pay £90 to spend an hour in a hide just to get photos of osprey diving for fish. And somehow I don't think Africa's fully sort of figured out that hide tourism for photographers is something that's so important and might help to preserve these places. And it's something that I just wanted to mention again for all the students in the room tonight who might think of ideas of going forward and to change policymakers' views. I know in Kenya, and Darcy can actually say a bit on this, we've opened, a vulture restaurant. Darcy's been behind that, which is an incredible advancement for East Africa. It's common in Southern Africa, not in East Africa. We feed the fish eagles like Faith and Justice spoke about, but there's no real thought of where does this go from there in terms of fish eagles or osprey, and perhaps using some of this money to be able to conserve.
I think that's a really important point because there is certainly in Britain, we just recently down the road from me in Rutland, we had a fish farm who were losing lots of fish to ospreys and other piscivorous species. And basically one option available to the owners would be to just net over the ponds. But actually what we decided was a much more proactive approach, was to build a photography hide and charge photographers to go and see the ospreys. And now that photography hide actually kept the fish farm in business over the last few years during the COVID pandemic, and then as a result of all the rising costs there are now. So it's become integral to their business, and there's a huge market for it. And I'm sure that if entrepreneurial people in all over the world, really should take note of that, because there is real potential to kind of develop that model and to replicate it in different places.
Yeah, definitely a lot of opportunities that have gone untapped. So yeah, it's a good conversation to start having, actually. The next question we have is from Alistair. Is juvenile survival better for Eastern European birds, which can follow the Nile as they travel south, rather than crossing the dry Sahara?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think I could answer that. I suspect that it, in some respects, it might be, because the birds that are further west also have to contend with sea crossings, and they can result in mortality there, as you've seen earlier. I think, though, the reality is that migration for young ospreys is, and for any juvenile bird, is an incredibly demanding thing, regardless of exactly where they're going. And because of the vagaries of weather and the vagaries of wind, a bird can be blown off course just about anywhere. So difficult to quantify that exactly. And I think, there might be something in it. Survival rates might be slightly higher, but the reality is that first migration is incredibly demanding for an osprey, regardless of where it's flying from.
Yeah. The next question we have is from Bart. Do you have already tracker data for birds overwintering in Spain or Portugal? Is there an increasing percentage there or visible there? Also, we have an East German bird in the Netherlands who already stayed here for 5 to 6 weeks. Will we see more? Will we see that more often, do you think?
Yeah, I think that is going to be the case. So there's definitely an increasing trend for European ospreys to only fly as far south as Spain and Portugal, definitely. And there have been increasing numbers recorded in the recent past 10 years. And I think that as Europe has milder winters as a result of climate change, some ospreys migrating south from, say, Scandinavia will winter at more northerly latitudes. I think that's fairly likely. So yeah, I suspect that might well be the case. It's also not uncommon for juvenile ospreys to have quite long stopovers on their first migration, because if you can imagine that, there's so much more I could have talked about in my talk, but juveniles, adults are kind of, they want to get back to their wintering site. But for a juvenile, it's not quite so important, because they've not got a known place they're flying to. So if they find somewhere en route where they're catching fish really readily, and most young ospreys don't start fishing until they actually set off on migration. If they find somewhere where they're catching fish readily, they can stay for a month or 2 months before continuing. So the bird in the Netherlands at the moment might well be a bird from, say, Norway or Sweden, which has found somewhere where it's catching loads of fish. And then it will continue onwards. So yeah, it's hard to say, but I think the general consensus is that as winters become milder, ospreys will winter further north in Europe.
All right, makes sense. So I'm looking through all the comments. It looks like those were the only questions we had left, and there are no hands raised as far as I can see. So I think that's probably a good point to end off the session and say thank you very much, Tim, for all the information and that amazing talk. It was really a great talk, fascinating species. Thank you to both Faith and Justice. You guys are truly an inspiration, all of you. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your information with us. It was fantastic having you along. We hope that we'll continue seeing more of your work as we go along. And for everyone else, Thank you for joining us once again on another episode of Share Screen Africa's Raptor Education Series. You can join us here next week, same time, same place, 7 p.m. South African time. You will get, if you visit Share Screen Africa, go to the events page, you'll be able to see all the Raptor episodes coming up in the following weeks. Next week, we're going to be speaking about secretary birds. I know there's a lot of interest around secretary birds, so do not miss that. And that is going to be with Cassie Carstens from BirdLife South Africa. So make sure you don't miss that. Once again, thank you all for joining us. And until next week, have a great time. I hope you see a lot of birds between now and next week. Good night to all.